Hi friends, it's Mr. Stokely, and I'm here to share another really good book with you. Um, as I record my books, don't feel like that you have to watch a certain one. Watch any one of them on my channel that you would like. I think you'd like them all. And on that note, today I've got one from one of my favorite authors, Patricia Polacco. It is called, whoops, Mr. Lincoln's Way. And it's a story about a troubled young man and his school principal, Mr. Lincoln. And Mr. Lincoln is the adult right here. So, Patricia Polacco, for those of you who have heard me tell stories before, you know I really enjoy her because they're stories from her childhood and there's a lot of truth in them. As a matter of fact, we call her stories a type of realistic fiction, which means the stories are real to a point, but she might add some things as she goes along. So that's why it's not a nonfiction book. And nonfiction, of course, means everything that you see in it's real. So this is called realistic fiction. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed Mr. Lincoln's Way. Give me a second to get the book centered. Let me turn my computer like so. Gotta prop my elbow up. Let's see. Here we go. Mr. Lincoln's Way. And Patricia Polacco, not only is she the illustrator, which means she draws the picture, I've already told you she's also the author. Here we go. Mr. Lincoln. He was the coolest principal in the whole world, or so most of the kids in school thought. He had the coolest clothes, he had the coolest smile, and he did the coolest thing. He had tea parties with Miss West's class. He took Miss Bliss' sixth graders on nature walks in the fall. He set up his telescope next to the pond in back of the school. And on special nights, he invited kids and their families to come and look at the stars. And in the winter, he was Santa Claus for the Christmas play. He would light the menorah for Hanukkah. He would wear a dashkili for Kwanzaa and a burnous for Ramadan. Mr. Lincoln was just plain cool. Well, everybody thought so, except for one kid. His name was Eugene Esterhaus. Mean Gene is what everybody called him. You see, Mean Gene, he would sass teachers, and he beat up most of the other kids on the playground. He was no student at all, because he drove Miss Dunkel crazy in English, and Mr. Chew wanted him completely dropped from art class. And, as you can tell, he was a bully. He always seemed angry, picking on kids and calling them names. He's really not a bad boy, said Mr. Lincoln. He's only troubled. To just about everybody in school, though, Eugene was trouble, with a capital T. Well, one day he leered at a first grader. "What you looking at, scumball?" Eugene said, and he pushed her down and he wrenched her backpack away. "I'm gonna go tell Mr. Lincoln," she said. "Yeah, you go ahead, you little brat. I'm not afraid of him." Then he stopped. Mr. Lincoln was standing right there. Eugene was in Mr. Lincoln's thoughts more than ever, and he knew that he had to find some way to reach him before it was too late. Well, one day as Mr. Lincoln was helping the fifth grade plant a tree in the beautiful new atrium, he noticed that Eugene was looking up into the branches of one of the other trees. There sat a bright red cardinal. 2 other days, Mr. Lincoln had seen Eugene standing at the atrium window watching the birds on the trees. Mr. Lincoln wondered to himself, is it possible that... Well, it wasn't a day later when Mr. Lincoln called Eugene into his office. Eugene slumped into a chair. Mr. Lincoln took a beautiful book out of his desk drawer, a book in blazing color, and it was all about birds. He turned to one page and he studied the illustration. You know, I've got these little birds all over my tree, and I'm not sure what they are. Eugene got out of his chair and he walked closer. Why, those are red-capped nuthatches. Weird to see 'em this time of year. Wow, you seem to know your birds, Mr. Lincoln said with a warm smile. Yeah, I do. You see, when I lived on my grandpa's farm, he had tons of birds around. He had chickens and thrashers and meadowlarks. We raised carrier pigeons together, all sorts of things. Wow, you've got quite a grandpa, said Mr. Lincoln. But Eugene just turned his back on Mr. Lincoln and he left the room. Do you guys want to try to guess what happened? Think about it. Well, you see, a week had gone by when Eugene ran into Mr. Lincoln by the atrium looking all glum. I've got a problem, Mr. Lincoln said. So? Said Eugene. Well, you see, that atrium was supposed to be full of birds, but they're not just coming. The principal looked into the empty atrium. Well, what plants are in there to make them want to stay? Well, it's probably not the right food either. And Eugene started to walk away. Did your grandpa teach you that? Eugene turned and looked at Mr. Lincoln for the first time. Maybe, he said. Well, do you suppose you could help us attract birds here to our atrium, Eugene? Mr. Lincoln handed him a book. Maybe this would help. Eugene seemed stunned at first, and then he took the beautiful book on birds in his hands, wrapped it in his arms, and he ran off down the hall. Well, as the days passed, Eugene never seemed to be without that bird book. His English teacher let Eugene read passages from the book in class. I'm so pleased to see him reading, said Miss Dunkel. And when he didn't have his nose in that book, he was almost always constantly out in the atrium. He and Mr. Lincoln made a list of plants and shrubs to buy, and types of grains and seeds to feed the birds. They even built 3 bird feeders together. That's when it started to happen. The birds began to come. There were nuthatches, bluebirds, a tanager, and many colored types of finches. So many different kinds that the whole school stood from time to time just to watch the wonder of them all in the atrium. Eugene seemed genuinely happy. He didn't even tease the other kids anymore. Well, one day, Miss Chew burst into Mr. Lincoln's office. There are 2 mallards nesting in the atrium, she said. Mr. Lincoln rushed to the hall, and sure enough, there in the atrium was a male and a female mallard. And there was their nest, near the southeastern corner of the atrium. Mr. Lincoln saw Eugene on the other side of the atrium giving them a thumbs up. You know, I was hoping that they might become a pair, Eugene said one day as he and Mr. Lincoln looked at the 5 perfect eggs in the nest. There's just one problem. You see, the ducklings are going to need to be near water. They'll need to get into a pond outside. They can't fly out of the top like their parents. You'll think of something, Eugene. I know you will, said Mr. Lincoln, and he put his hand on Eugene's shoulder. It was nice that he wasn't being called Mean Gene anymore. Well, it was only 3 days later when there was a commotion in the hall. Miss Belding rushed into Mr. Lincoln's office with Eugene in tow. Mr. Lincoln looked at Eugene in disbelief. What in the world happened? Well, I'll tell you what, said Miss Belding. But Eugene just sat in his chair and said nothing. He just sat looking all hateful and defiant. Trouble in the lunch line, the teacher said. He singled out 2 of our students from Mexico. He called them toads and other unacceptable names. Well, I'll take care of this, Mr. Lincoln said quietly. Mr. Lincoln sat down in front of the boy. Eugene, my skin is brown too. Eugene just looked at Mr. Lincoln. This I know, Eugene. Someone who loves birds the way you do couldn't possibly have this sort of hate in his heart. Eugene started to cry. My dad got real mad when I got home late from helping you. He said that you're not like us. Our kind, thought Mr. Lincoln. He led Eugene to the window of the atrium. It was alive with the songs of birds. You know, Eugene, I see sparrows and jays and cardinals. I see nuthatches and the mallards. Don't all those beautiful types and colors make this a beautiful place to be? For all of them? Eugene nodded his head, yes. Well, guess what? God made them all kinds, just like he made all of us. You see, Eugene, fact is, all of you children here at this school, with all your cool differences, you're all my little birds. Yep, my little birds. And that should be your answer to what is right or what's wrong with what your father said, Mr. Lincoln said quietly. Oh, my old man, he calls you all sorts of bad names, Mr. Lincoln. He's got an ugly name for just about everybody that's different from me and him. Mr. Lincoln didn't talk for the longest time. Well, Eugene, sometimes people get trapped in their thinking almost as surely as those ducklings will be trapped in the atrium. My grandpa just wasn't like that. Well, Mr. Lincoln put his arm around the boy's shoulder. I would have liked to have met your grandpa, but Eugene, you've got to promise me. Even when bad things happen at home, here at school, you need to treat all my little birds with kindness and respect. No more teasing and name-calling. Can you promise me that? And guess what, guys? Eugene promised. Eugene was good to his word. He became a great model citizen. He tried with all of his heart to keep his promise to Mr. Lincoln. Well, one bright morning, Eugene stopped at the atrium window. The eggs were starting to hatch. He ran from room to room and brought the whole school to watch. The ducklings, they were hatching one by one. At first, they were wet and unsteady, but in a short time, they were fuzzy and racing all about. And as the days passed, the mallard parents flew out of the atrium, landing on the pond just behind the school. They were leaving their babies for longer and longer periods of time. Eugene and Mr. Lincoln knew that the time was coming when they would need to get the ducklings out of the atrium and into the pond. And they came up with a plan. When the big day got there, classes were asked to stay in their rooms. Then Eugene and Mr. Lincoln opened the door to the atrium and they stepped inside. They had both practiced saying, ging, 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 like mallard parents. Now they were talking to the ducklings, coaxing them to follow. The father mallard waddled up to the doorway of the atrium and looked down the hall. And at the end of the hall, the father mallard could see the lawn and the pond. Ging, 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 said Eugene. Well, the mother mallard came out first, and then one by one her babies followed. Eugene walked down the hall, calling them over and over as the family waddled behind them. Well, all at once, the mother and father took the lead, and the ducklings scurried off after them. At the outside doorway, they stopped for a moment, and then the mother and the father mallard jumped out of the doorway and coaxed each of the ducklings to follow. Mr. Lincoln and Eugene both stood and watched as the ducklings raced down the hillside and plopped into the pond with their parents. Now I know where the expression "like a duck takes to water" comes from, Mr. Lincoln laughed. He couldn't believe how well both or all of the babies swam. Well, parents had all gathered at the top of the hill. They had been invited to watch from afar. Then Eugene heard a voice from behind them call out his name. Eugene, boy, over here. It was his grandpa. The boy raced up the hill, and Mr. Lincoln joined them both. This is my Gramps, said Eugene. Yeah, I know, said Mr. Lincoln. Eugene turned towards him. Had Mr. Lincoln something to do with this miracle, with his grandpa being here? Now the old man shook Mr. Lincoln's hand heartily. I would sure like to stay with you again, Grandpa, Eugene said as he and his grandfather walked up the hill together. The old man put his arm around the boy's shoulders. We'll see, son, we'll sure see, he said. Well, later, Eugene and Mr. Lincoln walked down by the pond together. Eugene needed something to say to Mr. Lincoln. You showed those ducklings the way out, Eugene, said Mr. Lincoln. Hey, you showed me the way out, Mr. Lincoln, Eugene smiled, and then he stopped and looked into the principal's eyes. I'll make you proud of me, Mr. Lincoln. I promise. And Friends, there we have Mr. Lincoln's Way, written and illustrated by Patricia Polacco. Sure hope you enjoyed that book. I'll be back next week with some more stories. So, friends, love you all. Continue to read. And remember, we've got books outside of the school, out where the circle drive is. Make sure to tell your mom and dad that. And as long as you're with an adult, your mom or your dad or any other adult that you trust from your home, come on down to the school and you can pick you out a book to check out and take home. All right, friends, we hope to see you all soon. Love you all very much. Remember, reading is succeeding. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, guys.